Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 77 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today's episode is another solo episode. A few weeks ago, I asked my followers for any questions they'd like me to answer in a future episode. I did that via an Instagram story, so if you are not following me on Instagram already, take a look because there is a lot of interesting stuff there as well. And if you are, you might have seen this story a few weeks ago, like I mentioned. I've done this once before for episode number 55. I got quite a few great questions and spent the past few weeks researching and preparing the answers. So today I'm going to respond to 4 of the questions I received via Instagram. But before we dive into these stories, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including James H. and Brian A. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. The first question comes from a follower who asked to remain anonymous, and he asked me to cover the deaths of 7 Spanish intelligence officers in Iraq in late November 2003. This is a little-known event in the United States, but was by far the most significant loss of life for Spanish government personnel during Operation Iraqi Freedom. At the time, 8 men from Spain's Centro Nacional de Inteligencia, or CNI, were temporarily working together in and around central Iraq. 4 of the agents were there preparing to replace the other 4 who were getting ready to leave at the end of their tour. So for a short period, there were twice as many men from the CNI in Iraq as normal. Their mission at the time was to help protect the Brigade Plus Ultra, the Spanish Army unit taking part in the occupation of Iraq. That unit was headquartered in Diwaniya, south of Baghdad. From there, the 8 men drove in 2 unarmored SUVs up to Baghdad for meetings at Coalition Provisional Headquarters and at Camp Victory on November 29, 2003. On the way back to Diwaniya, after their meetings, the vehicles were attacked. The 8 men were on their own, without armored vehicles, no security escort, and armed only with handguns and a single submachine gun, a Steyr TMP, I believe it was. In hindsight, they were completely unprepared to defend themselves against determined attackers, and unfortunately that is exactly what happened. At about 3:30 p.m. on the road near a town called Latifiya, a white Cadillac sedan overtook the 2 vehicles from behind. 2 men leaned out of the passenger windows and opened fire with AK rifles on the rear vehicle, a white Nissan Patrol SUV, and killed one of the agents and wounded another in that vehicle. The Cadillac sped forward again and fired into the front vehicle, a blue Chevy Tahoe, destroying the tires, killing the driver, and wounding another of the agents. With no one controlling the vehicle, the Tahoe drove off the road. Within just a few seconds, 4 of the 8 men were already dead or seriously wounded. The rear vehicle pulled up next to the Tahoe while the gunmen in the Cadillac drove away and weren't seen again. The surviving agents assessed the situation, but within just a couple of minutes began taking fire from a group of homes nearby. Both of their vehicles were equipped with Thuraya satellite phones, but it appears that the CNI agents couldn't use them to contact the Brigade Plus Ultra, which they were supporting in country. Instead, they had to call all the way back to CNI headquarters in Madrid to report what was happening. So the person in Madrid took a phone call in which they reported multiple dead and wounded, and gunshots and explosions were heard in the background. CNI did their best to coordinate a rescue by the unit in Iraq, but as you can imagine, that is not something that can be done within the space of a few minutes, as was necessary in this case. The men were all pinned down by small arms fire around the vehicles, and the decision was made to send one man, named Jose Manuel Sanchez Riera, to try to find a functional vehicle nearby that they could use to escape the area. Traffic had backed up on the main road through Latifiya, and many Iraqis were just standing around watching the firefight take place right in front of them. So Sanchez crossed the road to try to commandeer a vehicle, but he was quickly surrounded by an angry mob of Iraqis who seized him and took his weapon away from him. He wasn't able to use his weapon because apparently it had jammed on him. Because Sanchez was a practicing Catholic, he was wearing a necklace with the figure of the Virgin Mary on it. And the crowd of Iraqis yanked the necklace off of him and they started beating him. They were intent on forcing him into the trunk of a car when something incredible happened. An older Iraqi man who was apparently an influential and well-known local stepped forward out of the crowd and embraced Sanchez and kissed him on the cheek. This gesture of respect and non-aggression apparently pacified the crowd, and they immediately relaxed and released Sanchez. He was then able to flag down a taxi and then find several Iraqi police officers nearby. But by the time he returned to the scene of the ambush with the Iraqi police in tow, all of his companions were dead. The whole event lasted approximately 30 minutes, and the agents fought back until the remaining survivors ran out of ammunition. Not only were they killed, but their bodies were desecrated by the angry Iraqis before they could be recovered. Video footage taken after the event by journalists shows the Tahoe completely burned out and blood-stained clothing on the ground nearby. Iraqis are seen showing off that clothing to the cameras and stomping on it as a sign of disrespect for the dead Spanish agents. Once coalition forces arrived on the scene, the bodies were recovered and transported back to Spain the following day. Sanchez accompanied his dead teammates back as well. This was an enormous event in Spain, so Spanish President José María Aznar and the Minister of Defense, Federico Trillo, and many other senior government leaders visited with the families and attended the funerals of the slain agents. Back in Iraq, coalition forces worked to locate the attackers. Less than 2 weeks later, the town of Latifiya was raided in the middle of the night with 9 suspects arrested. The subsequent interrogations led to 5 additional arrests a few days later. Then, a few months after that, an Iraqi translator who had worked with 2 of the Spanish agents was arrested on suspicion he'd been involved in planning the attack. He was held in Abu Ghraib prison for a year, but was eventually released without ever being charged with anything. A few years later, another Iraqi insurgent came forward and claimed to a Spanish journalist that his group, called Ansar al-Sunnah, had actually carried out the attack. He said the group had set up an ambush that day intending to attack any foreigners that traveled on the highway through Latifiya, and that the CNI agents had not been specifically targeted. He provided some video taken that day, which included footage of ID and credit cards taken from the dead agents before their bodies were recovered. So it's not clear if the true perpetrators of the attack were ever arrested or not. It seems obvious that a huge number of mistakes on the part of the CNI agents led to their deaths. The lack of armored vehicles, the lack of heavy weapons, the inability to communicate with nearby Spanish troops. But in the aftermath of the attack, information came to light that initially the team had tried to go as low profile as possible when traveling by dressing like the locals and driving unarmored vehicles. But by the time of the ambush, they had already decided to dispense with that strategy because of the danger level in the country, and in fact, armored vehicles were already on the way from Spain for them. But the vehicles weren't scheduled to arrive until January 2004, just a few weeks after the ambush occurred. As for the lack of heavy weapons, I found one article in which a Spanish journalist who was in Iraq before the ambush and knew one of the agents reported that the agent complained to him that U.S. forces had confiscated their rifles and left them with sidearms only. That's extremely confusing, and the agent was very upset because they were a part of coalition forces and should not have been treated like a potential threat. I have to wonder if there was some kind of mix-up over responsibilities or authorities in Iraq that led to this, but we may never know, unfortunately. The event has been covered many times in Spanish media over the past 2 decades, and a memorial was built at CNI headquarters to commemorate the loss of the 7 agents. There's also a new docudrama series which just debuted this year on the Spanish streaming platform Movistar Plus, called The 8 of Iraq, or Los Ocho de Iraq, which features interviews with many former CNI personnel, as well as recreated scenes of the ambush. The next question comes from Dale C., who asked what kind of everyday carry or EDC items a spy might carry while working. That's a very interesting question, and while I think we can all understand that the true answer is it depends, I didn't just want to leave it at that. So I decided to reach out to a few former case officers and ask them what their own go-to tools and weapons were. First is Doug Pattison, who served as a case officer with the CIA for more than 10 years. He was my guest for the 2nd episode of this podcast, so if you want to learn more about him after this, go all the way back to episode 2. You can also find him on Instagram as @TexasSpyDad, so make sure to give him a follow as he posts all kinds of great photos and insights on a regular basis. I asked him specifically what he would want with him in a non-permissive environment, in other words, a place with an unusually high threat level. In that scenario, he told me he would normally carry 2 different knives, one which could be given up easily if necessary, and one much better concealed. After that, he'd want shims for picking handcuffs or zip ties in case he's detained. Also, a hidden handcuff key and possibly a lockpick set depending on the environment. He'd always have a lot of cash on him, a small first aid kit, and a backup means of communication, plus a map of the local area, and, of course, the most important tools of all, a notepad and pen. He also told me he'd acquire all of this on his own. These were not items that were issued to him by the agency. Next, I asked Enrique Rick Prado, who you might remember from episode 49 of the podcast. Rick had a pretty incredible career spanning many years with the agency. He worked in Honduras with the Nicaraguan Contras in the early 1980s. Later on, he served in the Middle East, the Philippines, and South Korea. He was also at the National Counterterrorism Center in Washington when the September 11th attacks occurred. Now he's recently retired and has written his memoirs called Black Ops, The Life of a CIA Shadow Warrior. I'll link it up in the show notes as it's a must-read if you're interested in this kind of history. The timing for this question was perfect, actually, because Rick was recently interviewed for a terrific article in Recoil magazine. Among other things he talked about in the article, Rick described his current preferred EDC gear. Now that the article is published, I can share that information here as well. When he's wearing shorts and a t-shirt in the summer, he carries a Sig Sauer P365 SAS. When he's dressed for cooler weather and can conceal something larger, his go-to is a Glock 43 with a 10-round magazine, or even a Glock 48 with a 15-round magazine. He also carries a Bob Casper Dragon fixed-blade fighting knife on his left side. You can find Rick on Instagram as well as @Prado_Rick. That's PRADO_RIC. He posts some very interesting stuff as well every now and then. After talking to Rick, I asked Michael Sellers from episode 3 of the podcast. You may remember he was assigned to Moscow Station, where he carried out 32 operational acts in one of the most difficult and non-permissive environments in the world at the time. When he was on his way to meet with a source, as he was at the time of his very dramatic arrest in 1986, he carried a large number of highly incriminating items on him out of necessity. These might typically include miniature cameras or film to turn over to the source, along with cash payments on occasion. There might also be a list of information desired from them, or some sort of covert communications device to put into use, or all of that. Plus, he'd be wearing a disguise and potentially have other disguise items on him that he had already used or would soon use to change his appearance and throw off surveillance. That's why the planning for these types of meetings was so intense and why they happened only when absolutely necessary. But if he wasn't actually on the way to meet someone, but instead was on his way out to do site surveys for future operations or something else, he would carry a street map with him and a small Olympus 35mm SLR camera. There were much smaller cameras available that could fit on a keychain, but he preferred the Olympus and would use his body to shield it when he finally started taking photos to prevent any surveillance team from seeing what he was doing. Neither a map nor a regular-sized camera would necessarily be out of place for a U.S. Embassy employee who appeared to be off-duty and sightseeing in the city. And although he didn't mention this to me specifically in response to this question, I've read elsewhere that he also conducted some site survey work on a previous assignment in Poland to assist in preparing escape routes for a very important and now very famous source in the Polish military named Richard Kuklinski. So he had some experience in exactly this sort of thing before he arrived in Moscow. Later, when he worked in the Philippines, the threat was far different, so he carried a 9mm handgun on occasion, although he didn't mention to me which specific model. I would not be surprised if it was a Browning high power, because I know that Doug Pattison has mentioned carrying one of those in the past while working. Michael told me that in retrospect it might have actually been detrimental to his safety because it gave him a false sense of security. You might remember that Colonel Nick Rowe was attacked and killed in the Philippines, and Michael was there at the same time and worked with Colonel Rowe. When he was ambushed, there were 5 attackers armed with AK rifles who fired 106 rounds total at his vehicle. So Michael doesn't think that him being armed would have saved his life if they'd chosen to ambush him as well. He was also driving around in an armored vehicle at the time, and the windows wouldn't even roll down, so it's not like he would have been able to shoot back in case of a vehicle ambush. Lastly, I asked former Air America pilot Lee Gossett if he carried anything in particular. Lee flew into and out of just about every hotspot in the world from the 1960s up until just a few years ago. He's been on the podcast 2 times already to discuss his experiences in detail, so go back and listen to episodes 13 and 75 if you haven't already. And Lee told me that he never had a specific EDC kit or a standard bug-out bag over the years. I'm sure he carried or was issued a wide variety of items during his flying career, but it changed depending on the time frame and the environment and the mission. So, as you can see, I got a wide variety of answers from some very experienced people, and just as I expected from the outset, the true answer is, it depends. The next question comes from Sajad D., who asked who I think of as the worst spy ever. There are many people throughout history who tried and failed at espionage. There is one person who comes to mind immediately, although I have to admit that I hate to mention him in this context. I'm talking about Nathan Hale, who many of us probably think of as an American hero of the Revolutionary War. Nathan Hale has been called America's first spy. He was just 21 years old and a captain serving in the Continental Army when he volunteered for a risky mission to Long Island, which was under British control at the time. He posed as a Dutch school teacher, and he was tasked to gather intelligence on when, where, and how the British were planning to cross Long Island Sound and invade Manhattan. Hale landed on Long Island on September 17th. He survived there for just 5 more days. Hale was quickly approached and befriended by Major Robert Rogers, the famous leader of Rogers Rangers, which was an incredibly effective scout and special operations unit formed during the French and Indian War in 1755. Rogers was a master of unconventional warfare, and the 28 rules of ranging he wrote for his unit are still taught to modern-day U.S. Army Rangers. He's even been described as the most capable warrior in North America during his lifetime. At the time of Hale's mission, Rogers was working for General Howe, the commander of British forces. He had a very tense and tenuous relationship with both the Continental Army and the British government at this time. He had earlier tried to join the Continental Army, but was distrusted by General Washington and others. So they allowed him to pass through the territory they occupied at the time, but didn't bring him into the fold. So after that, Rogers volunteered to fight with the British, as he had had a good relationship with General Howe in years past. But he also still owed huge debts to some creditors in England, and had even spent 2 years in debtor's prison while the revolution was beginning in the 13 colonies. And now, Nathan Hale had just crossed his path. Rogers was very observant and very astute, and he correctly assessed that Captain Hale was a spy. So Rogers approached him and pretended to be a fellow spy himself on a similar mission for the Continental Army. Rogers was convincing enough that Hale met with him for dinner again the following evening, where Rogers brought with him several men whom he said were also members of his spy ring. Hale spoke of his own secret mission in front of these new men who were now witnesses to his confession. He was immediately arrested by the British Army and hanged the following day. At his execution, Hale is alleged to have spoken the words which propelled him into the history books. "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." However, historians haven't found any truly compelling evidence that he actually said that. Several men who attended his hanging wrote about it in their diaries or in letters afterwards, and those were preserved. And those accounts are all unanimous in stating that Hale met his demise with courage and calm and honor. He was praised for his demeanor by the witnesses, but none of them wrote down Hale's words verbatim. The details of his mission and his capture were a mystery for more than 2 centuries until a handwritten, unpublished history of the Revolutionary War was donated to the Library of Congress in the year 2000 by the Tiffany family, who were the descendants of its original author, who was named Consider Tiffany. He was a Connecticut shopkeeper who remained loyal to the crown during the Revolution, although it doesn't appear that he provided any active support to the British. But because of his loyalist sentiments, he was held under house arrest by the Continental Army for 15 months. Historians at the Library of Congress have studied the so-called Tiffany manuscript very carefully and came to the conclusion that it appeared to be factual in many details and corroborated everything else that was already known from other sources about Nathan Hale's mission. On the surface, Hale certainly appears to have been a terrible spy. On his very first mission, not only was he captured and executed, but he was caught because he confessed who he was to practically the first person to speak to him on Long Island behind enemy lines. He also didn't communicate any useful intelligence back to Washington's army. However, if you examine the details of his mission closely, as several historians have, Hale was essentially doomed from the start. To begin with, he had no training or experience in espionage whatsoever. He had joined the Continental Army the year before, along with several of his brothers, but hadn't even seen any combat yet when he volunteered for this mission. Furthermore, he was not issued anything useful for concealing his activities, such as invisible ink or a cipher to use for any letters he sent, both of which were commonly available to colonial spies at the time. I want to tell you all about my new favorite fragrance for daily wear. It's called Novichok by Clandestine Laboratories. Novichok is distinctive and combines notes of cocoa powder, chocolate almond tort, rose, jasmine, cinnamon, tonka bean, Peru balsam, and musk tonkin. Unlike some of the other colognes I've worn in the past, I found that Novichok stays with me all day, which was a pleasant surprise. If the name sounds familiar to you, then you might already know why I was so happy to find this company and support them. The name itself comes from the very well-known Russian nerve agent Novichok, which has been used in recent years in several assassination attempts, which I've covered here on the podcast in previous episodes. The name is spelled differently, but rest assured, once you put this on, you'll still make a killer impression wherever you go. Novichok is made in small batches by Clandestine Laboratories and, like their entire lineup, is available only via direct order. If you're not sure which of their fragrances is right for you, you can also check out the Discovery Stash. 6 different mini bottles at one great price, which is perfect for finding your signature scent. So make sure to check them out either via a link in the show notes of this episode or at their website clandestinelaboratories.com or on Instagram at Clandestine Laboratories. He also had a somewhat distinctive appearance because he was taller than average and he had scars on his face from a gunpowder explosion that occurred years before. It also appears that most of his unit back on Manhattan Island were aware that he had volunteered to slip behind enemy lines undercover as a schoolteacher, and there wasn't any kind of a cover story created to explain why he was abruptly leaving the unit. So it's entirely conceivable that if a British spy in the colonial army learned of his mission, they could have informed the British Army of exactly who Captain Hale was, what he was doing, and where he could be found. Which, to me, begs the question. Is it truly a coincidence that one of the first people Hale spoke to was Robert Rogers. There's no evidence pointing either way from what I have seen, but it is so incredibly unfortunate for Hale that it almost defies belief. Is it possible that Rogers had already been informed of a spy who just arrived in the area a few days before with scars on his face and claiming to be a Dutch schoolteacher? Another realistic possibility, though, is that he'd simply been recognized by a loyalist who informed British authorities that they'd seen a Colonial Army officer in town, pretending to be an unemployed schoolteacher. Hale grew up in Connecticut, not far at all from Long Island, and many loyalists traveled back and forth through the area. Plus, the colonial population was relatively small at that time, even in the area surrounding New York, so it's entirely feasible that someone who knew who he was saw him there. It is known for certain, based on the recently discovered unpublished history book I mentioned earlier, that after he was caught, he was positively identified by several loyalists who knew him from before the war began, which further cemented his status as a spy. But a captured prisoner would naturally draw a lot of attention from onlookers, so we only know for certain that he was recognized after his arrest, not before. At a minimum, this was an extremely foolhardy mission, and the officers who sent Hale on his way so completely unprepared were practically sentencing him to death themselves. The American Revolution was a desperate time for the colonists, of course, and the risk of capture or death is something every soldier in every army in history has had to face. Nevertheless, when Nathan Hale was caught, he faced the consequences like a man, by all accounts. And regardless of the failure of his mission, he certainly embodied the kind of courage that led the Founding Fathers to break away from the British Empire, despite the knowledge that it would bring a war right to their doorsteps. Now, there's no way I would feel right only discussing the failed mission of a very brave volunteer during the American Revolution, so I also want to leave you with the story of someone who betrayed his country for the worst possible reasons and got almost nothing in return other than a prison sentence. Ariel Weinman was a patriotic teenager who followed in his grandfather's footsteps to join the U.S. Navy in 2003, just after graduating high school. Just before shipping off to boot camp, he secretly proposed to his high school sweetheart, knowing her anti-war parents were disappointed in his decision to enlist in the military. After completing his initial training, Weinman was assigned to the USS Albuquerque, which was a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, as a fire control technician. Over time, while serving on board the Albuquerque, he became disillusioned with Navy life. He witnessed a superior accepting monetary bribes in exchange for improved performance scores and felt ignored and forgotten by his chain of command. On his first day of shore leave, following a 6-month cruise, his fiancée broke up with him and returned the engagement ring he'd given her the year before. He later learned that the breakup was mostly due to her parents' influence and that they were sending her off to private school in Switzerland. He decided that it was time for him to get out of the Navy any way that he could and win back his ex-fiancée. So Weinman hatched a plan that he hoped would give him both money and leverage to start over in Austria near his ex-fiancée's Swiss school. He stole a laptop computer off of the sub and downloaded classified files related to the Tomahawk cruise missile, as well as profiles on 29 Austrian citizens who were known to U.S. intelligence agencies. His intention was to take this information and use it as a bargaining chip to get asylum in Austria and make a new life for himself. That is what I would call an ill-conceived plan at best. In July 2005, he went away without leave and flew to Europe with the classified documents plus $7,000 in cash that he had saved up. Once he arrived in Austria, the confused customs agent at the airport just granted him standard entry and ignored his verbal request for asylum, which I assume made no sense whatsoever in that context. So then Weinman kind of listlessly resided in Austria for several weeks before he hatched a new plan to approach the Russian embassy and request residency there, using the classified information as leverage. At the Russian embassy, he handed over the binder and made his request. The Russian official thanked him and told him to wait for a letter in the mail. A few weeks later, Weinman realized he'd handed over everything he had at the first meeting and got nothing in return. Not long after that, he flew back to Dallas, Texas in March 2006 after staying in Mexico City and federal agents were waiting to arrest him at the airport due to his status as a deserter. During a military trial at Norfolk, Virginia, he pled guilty to charges of espionage, desertion, theft, and destruction of military property. The Navy also charged that he had attempted to contact foreign governments in Bahrain and Mexico City, in addition to his visits to the Russian embassy in Vienna. So at just 22 years of age, Weinman was sentenced to 12 years in prison in December 2006, demoted to E1, and dishonorably discharged from the Navy. As far as I know, he never got back with his ex-fiancée either. From what I can tell, he's now been out of prison for quite some time and is living in South America and keeping a low profile. I'm sure it's difficult to put your life back together after something like this, so he might have felt the need to move very far away and start over from scratch. And that's pretty understandable, I think. The next question comes from Matthew M., who asked if the show The Americans has any truth to it regarding sleeper agents placed in Western countries. And the answer to that question is definitely yes. For anyone not already familiar with the program The Americans, I really encourage you to watch it. If you enjoy what you've seen or heard here already, then this is absolutely a show for you. It aired for 6 seasons between 2013 and 2018. The show is set in the early to mid-1980s, mostly around the Washington, D.C. area. It is centered around a married couple named Philip and Elizabeth Jennings, who run a travel agency and have 2 children together. But in reality, they are Soviet agents recruited many years before, specifically to infiltrate American society and conduct espionage against us. I won't go over the whole plot by any means, but it's very well made and has received a lot of praise by people who worked during that era, including Jana Mendez, just as one example. The show was created by Joe Weisberg, who is a former agency employee himself. To begin with, Matthew referred to the couple in the show as sleeper agents, and that is how they started out, but during the series they are very, very active. They need to be, of course, in order to have an interesting fictional TV series in the first place. But entering the country and integrating as a sleeper agent, even without actually committing other acts of espionage, can be very difficult and very risky. Jack Barsky from episode 10 of this podcast discussed this quite a bit because that's how he entered the country. In fact, the series shared a lot in common with his own life, and he's spoken publicly about it on many occasions. For example, in the series, an FBI counterintelligence agent moves in next door to the Jennings house, although this is entirely coincidental as they aren't yet suspected of anything. In Barsky's case, the FBI intentionally moved one of their counterintelligence agents into the house next door once they became aware of him, in order to keep him under very close surveillance. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, you should definitely go back and do so after this. His daughter Chelsea also described what it was like learning her father was a spy when she was a teenager and the impact it had on the rest of her life. You might be thinking that the name Jack Barsky is an unusual name for a Russian spy, and of course you're right. That's the name he was given as part of his alias when he came over. He was born Albrecht Dietrich in East Germany, and the name Jack Barsky was taken from the grave of an American boy who died at age 10. A Soviet government employee stationed at their embassy in Washington, D.C., found the grave at the Mount Lebanon Cemetery in Adelphi, Maryland. They needed the name of someone who had been born around the same time as Albrecht, but who died within a few years before needing any other identification besides a birth certificate. They then applied for a copy of the original birth certificate and used that to begin building his new fake identity. This is a process known as tombstoning, and it's been used many times in the past for many different agents infiltrating the West. Once Albrecht/Jack had a new identity, he flew into Canada after first taking several connecting flights along the way in order to mask his point of origin in the USSR. And he then made his way into the United States. One of his earliest and most important tasks was building his new identity, such as getting and applying for and being granted a U.S. passport, not just for himself, but also to learn the process and pass that information back to the KGB. They had a need at the time to learn the ins and outs of it as well, to ensure that their future recruits wouldn't run into any problems when they infiltrated the U.S. as well. Jack went undetected in the U.S. for about 10 years and eventually decided that he liked it so much he didn't want to go back home. When the KGB ordered him to return home, he refused and told them he was HIV positive, which at the time they were deathly afraid of. So they essentially left him alone after that. However, just a few years later, in 1992, he was identified in the Metrokin archives, which you're probably familiar with as well. An investigation began, and when he was finally confronted and interviewed by the FBI, they decided to use him as an asset rather than charge him with any crimes, because he hadn't been active for years and was willing to talk to them about his entire career. The show The Americans also takes a lot of inspiration from a much more recent situation, the so-called Russian 10. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with them because of how heavily publicized the story was when it occurred. I've mentioned them on several occasions in the past, but haven't done a full episode on them yet, but I probably will one day in the future, as it's an all-around amazing story. But to put it briefly, the Russian 10 was a network of agents from the Foreign Intelligence Service called the SVR, which entered the country one or two at a time over a period of several years starting in the 1990s. They've also been called illegals because while espionage activity on behalf of a foreign government is obviously illegal everywhere, in many cases that work is done by people who work out of their country's embassy and have diplomatic status, even if it's under an alias. That's why so often, when someone is caught in the act, they are usually only held for a day or two before being turned over to their own government and declared persona non grata, then kicked out of the country. That was the case for Michael Sellers from episode 3. But illegal agents aren't affiliated with the embassy or their own government at all. So if they're caught, they potentially face a lengthy prison sentence or even a death sentence, depending on which country they're working in. So that's a far more dangerous assignment. And that was the status for Philip and Elizabeth Jennings in the TV series. The Russian 10 worked to establish lives for themselves mostly in the Boston, New York, and Northern Virginia areas. The group included 2 different couples who lived together using the aliases Richard and Cynthia Murphy and Howard Heathfield and Tracy Leanne Foley. The best-known agent of the whole network was Anna Chapman, not because of how well she performed, but because of how good she looked, honestly. According to a decrypted message the FBI obtained that was sent from the SVR to the network, their mission was, quote, to search and develop ties in policy-making circles in the U.S. and send intelligence reports back, unquote. Despite many years living and working in the U.S., they never really made it into the policy-making circles that were their target. They also faced some obstacles, including that several of them could never quite shed their Russian accents, even though they spoke excellent English. Over the years, they used various methods for communicating back to Moscow Center. For example, according to an FBI affidavit, Anna Chapman would go to various locations around New York City, always on a Wednesday, and use her laptop to create a private Wi-Fi network that could only be accessed by her laptop and one other. The other one belonged to a Russian from the consulate in New York City, so he would be nearby at the same time she created the network. They'd both log in, exchange messages, and then depart. They didn't have to be seen together, and in fact, on at least one occasion, she was sitting inside a Starbucks, and he was outside in a van, so they weren't seen together at all. It's only because the FBI already had both of them under surveillance and were aware of this method of communicating that they could tie them together. As far as I know, it's never been confirmed exactly how the FBI learned of the existence of the network, but it appears likely that the information came from a defector. Most of the documents related to the investigation that have been released by the FBI so far are very heavily redacted, but they were all identified and under investigation for several years before they were actually arrested over the course of a single weekend in June 2010. Just a few days after their arrest, an agreement was made between the U.S. and Russian governments to swap all 10 of them for 4 prisoners in Russia, 3 of whom had previously worked with the U.S. and U.K. governments. I'm not going to tell the whole story in complete detail now because it deserves a much longer telling sometime in the future. Meanwhile, there's another example of a successful sleeper agent from even more recently, which I just posted about on Instagram not too long ago. In fact, she was never arrested or even investigated while she was on assignment, and no one knew about her affiliation with the Russian government until years after she returned home. Her alias was Maria Adela Rivera, and she lived and worked undetected in Italy for nearly 10 years. A months-long investigation by the research cooperative Bellingcat culminated in August of 2022 with an in-depth look at the life and cover story of this GRU agent, whose real name is Olga Kolobova, and who targeted NATO officials in Italy for several years. Maria claimed to be the child of a Peruvian mother and Soviet father and applied for Peruvian citizenship under false pretenses in 2005, although her application was rejected by an alert Peruvian civil servant. She moved to Italy sometime in 2009 using a Russian passport and eventually opened a luxury boutique called Serin in Naples, which catered to wealthy socialites in the area. Beginning in 2013, she joined a local chapter of the Lions Club charitable organization as the secretary. Now, this particular chapter of the Lions Club was filled with NATO officers from several different countries, and Maria became a driving force for event planning and networking for the group. Over the next 5 years, she developed close relationships, some of which were romantic, with officers and civilian staff from Belgium, Italy, Germany, and the United States. She attended many events, dinners, and fundraisers that were either sponsored by or affiliated with NATO, including the U.S. Marine Corps Ball. But it's unclear so far whether she ever gained access to sensitive information of any type. Then, on September 15th, 2018, Maria abruptly departed Naples for Moscow without speaking to any of her friends or associates beforehand. As it turns out, one day earlier, Bellingcat had posted another extensive investigation revealing a previously unknown tradecraft error by the GRU, in which they issued sequentially numbered passports in false names to their agents in the infamous Unit 29155. Maria's Russian passport was within the range of numbers associated with the GRU, so clearly she was warned that she was in danger of arrest or investigation by someone in the GRU as soon as that story broke, and she quickly got out of country. Well, compared to other long-term illegal agents operating in Europe or in the United States, Maria was fairly successful in that she lived and worked for more than 10 years without raising suspicion. She targeted individuals of interest to Russian intelligence, in NATO, of course, and built relationships with them, and left before any alarms were raised by counterintelligence personnel. The Bellingcat researchers were able to track down her account on the WhatsApp messaging app and even sent her a message asking for her comment on the whole situation before they published their report. According to them, she left them on red. I'm sure that was a pretty disconcerting message for her to receive years after she left Italy, and presumably thought that she was in the clear. There are a lot of other examples as well, including the recent arrest of a man in Norway who is alleged to be a Russian spy named Mikhail Mikushin. He was using the alias Jose Guillamaria and claimed to be a researcher from Brazil. It didn't help matters, though, that apparently he spoke very little Portuguese, which would be a pretty obvious suspicious indicator to practically anyone who he meets. He was working at the Center for Peace Studies at the University of Tromsø and was studying hybrid warfare, which probably put him in contact with policymakers and military and government personnel that would have been of great interest to the GRU. He also spent several years in Canada under that alias, where he earned a PhD. And he used a Brazilian passport after applying for one, claiming his mother was Brazilian. This was the same strategy that Olga Kolobova tried in Peru, but in Mikhail's case, it actually worked. However, an investigation by Bellingcat, yet again, led to his arrest before he left Norway again for Russia, so he's awaiting trial at the moment. The bottom line is, yes, there have been illegals and sleeper agents throughout Europe and North America in the past, and there are probably still many undiscovered agents right now. That's all the questions for the moment, but these episodes are pretty fun to put together, so I'm sure I'll do another one in the near future. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions this time around, and keep an eye on my Instagram stories for the next time I ask all of you to submit questions of your own. If you're interested in more Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram at Spycraft 101 and at cold.war.stamps. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there is lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.